Section 20 of The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tavarish. The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories by Leonard Merrick. The Bishop's Comedy. 1. The Bishop of Westborough had seldom found himself in a more delicate position. Since Sweetbay objected so strenuously to its rector being a dramatist, Sweetbay was clearly no place for the rector, and it devolved upon his lordship to intimate the fact. But secretly his lordship was also guilty of dramatic authorship, and installments of his comedy were even now in the hands of that accomplished actress, Miss Kitty Clarges. For this reason and another the bishop had wakeful nights. However, he did what was required. With all his customary blandness, and perhaps a shade more, he pointed out to the Reverend Baker Barling that the parish of Sweetbay was unsuitable for him, and offered him instead a living which commended itself to the Barlings not at all. Indeed, Mrs. Baker Barling was so highly incensed by the removal that the rector had on several occasions to say "my dear" to her reprovingly. The bishop was young for a bishop. His classical features and the dignity of his carriage would have compelled attention even if he had been a mere man. He never said anything noteworthy, but he voiced the sentiments of the unthinking in stately language. This made him generally admired. It is not to be inferred that he was insincere. He had been granted a popular mind. He shared with the majority a strong aversion from disagreeable truths. His widest reflections were bounded by the word unpleasant, and every truth that was unpleasant was to the Bishop of Westborough one of those things that are better left undiscussed. He had a warm affection for this phrase, which occurred in all his articles for the cultured reviews. It was a phrase that suggested much earnestness of thought, while it spared him the exertion of thinking at all. Domestically he had been no less fortunate than in his mental limitations. He possessed a little wife, who listened to him with the utmost patience, and he had seen both his girls make brilliant matches in their first season. The history of the bridegroom had in each case been one of those things that are better left undiscussed. Accordingly the bishop boasted a grateful heart. In fact, when he reflected how abundantly Providence had blessed him, he was more than normally horrified to think of the impious murmurings of the poor. That a personage of his environment and disposition had been tempted towards so unepiscopal a course as writing a comedy proves how true it is that nothing happens but the unforeseen. It was one of the speediest conquests of Miss Clarges's career, a career in which peers had been plentiful, but prelates had hitherto been lacking. He had made her acquaintance at a reception. She was clever off the stage as well as on it, and had always tempered her indiscretions with tact. Duchesses called her "dear." He thought her the most fascinating woman he had ever met, and talked to her about the conditions of the English stage with considerable satisfaction to himself. "What a dramatist your lordship would have made if you had not been a bishop," she murmured with rapt eyes. "Oh, you are jesting," said the bishop, asking for more. "No, indeed I mean it," returned the lady reverently. "You have what we call the sense of the theatre, and it is so rare. You startled me just now. You know by intuition things that the professional dramatist needs years of experience to find out. I can't tell you how extraordinary it is." She regarded him as if she were being confronted by a miracle. Partly because he was very vain, and partly because Miss Clarges was very good-looking, the lie that she forgot almost as soon as it was spoken had lingered caressingly with the Bishop. Sitting in the palace one afternoon with nothing to do, he found himself scribbling Act I, a drawing room. He had no definite intention of continuing, still less had he a definite plot, but like everyone who is deficient in self-criticism, he wrote with prodigious facility, and his first act was finished in a few days. Miss Clarges had been a good deal surprised to receive a semi-humorous note from the Bishop of Westborough, reminding her of their conversation and hinting that he would be glad to have her opinion of a dramatic bantling. Tea and a tete-a-tete followed in the lady's boudoir. She found Act I all that she had dreaded, and told him it was most original. Beaming with importance, he perpetrated Act II, and read her that. She was contemplating a season of management, and in sanguine moments reflected that a practised hand might knock the Bishop's comedy into something like shape, and that the Bishop's name on the bills would be well worth having. So she offered various suggestions about the leading part, and was at home as often as he chose to call, and for some weeks he had chosen to call very often indeed. Remember that he was only 50. He had married when he was 25, married a girl who was taken by his handsome face and who brought him a very respectable dower. Though the dower had fascinated him more than the girl, the courtship had comprised his sentimental experiences. As has been said, he had had no reason to complain of his choice. He had been remarkably successful in all his relationships. He felt that his wife worshipped him, and her worship, and his worldly progress, had contented him fully. But now, for the first time in his career, he was thrown into intimate association with a woman who had captivated those who were seeing life and those who had seen it, and the Bishop of Westborough fell in love with her as violently as many wiser men had done before him. As for her, it was the first time in the woman's career that she had been openly admired by a bishop. At the beginning she was attracted by his reputation, much as her youngest adorers had been attracted by her own, but presently she was attracted by his homage. He appealed to her one weakness, her vanity. Though she thought it a pity that he wanted to write a comedy, she considered him a great man. His profound belief in himself, supported by a nation's esteem, imposed on her. To have made a conquest of a pillar of the church flattered her inordinately. The novelty of the situation had its effect on the actress too, and, to her unspeakable amazement, Kitty Clarges fell in love with the bishop. It was at this juncture that circumstances had forced him to mortify the rector of Sweetbay. "The affair makes me doubt whether I ought to proceed with my own play," he admitted to her one afternoon. "My dear friend!" She meant, "What rot!" But she no longer said, "What rot!" even to other actresses, and she wore dove-colored gowns and had been to hear him preach. The higher life was a little trying, but she liked to feel worthier of him. "My action in the matter may be misconstrued. Of course, I've simply deferred to the local prejudice, but it may be thought that I disapprove of the man's tendencies. If I figured as a dramatist myself a little later, I might be placed in an ambiguous position. Perhaps we might overcome the difficulty by a pseudonym?" She looked blank. "Your lordship's name will be a draw. I am afraid a pseudonym would mean waiving a great deal." "Financially? The pecuniary result is not important to me." But it was important to her. "If the secret were really kept, you'd be waiving all the kudos too," she added. "Well, we must consider," said the bishop, clinking the ice in his glass. "You shall advise me, though I fear I am exceeding an author's privileges. By the way, does the manageress always offer the author a whiskey and soda?" "She offered you an alternative," said Miss Clarges, laughing. "The whiskey and soda was your choice. But you don't really mean to throw the comedy up, do you? Think of poor me." The bishop's eyes were eloquent. "Thinking of you," he said after a lingering gaze, "I have this to say. You will be put to considerable expense in bringing out my work, and, novice as I am, I'm aware that a theatre is a heavy speculation. If I withhold the advantage of my name from the piece, I shall claim to share your risk." "You are very generous, dear friend. I don't think I could say yes to that." "It is no more than fair." "I'd rather not. I shouldn't care for you to find money for me," said Kitty Clarges, and was conscious that she had soared into the higher life indeed. "You are scarcely treating me as the dear friend you allow me to believe myself," urged the bishop, missing the greatest compliment of his life. "Oh," she said under her breath. "I should be serving my own ends, and besides—" "Besides what?" "It would make me very happy to think that I served you." Her eyelids fell. "You have served me." "I rejoice to hear it. May I ask how?" "You've served me by your friendship. You've given me different thoughts, taken me out of myself, done me good in some ways." She sighed deeply. "I've learned that there are so much realer things than the shams that satisfied me before we met. I've been a very worldly woman, you know, don't you?" "Few human beings are stronger than temptations, child," he said melodiously, "and yours must have been many." "I used to want you to think me better than I am. Now I do and I don't. Oh, I can't explain." "You are showing me your heart. You need not spell it." "I suppose what I mean really is that I want you to know me as I am, and yet to like me just as much. I wonder if you would." He laid a gentle hand upon her shoulder. "Why not put me to the test?" "I daren't," she said. "Am I so hard?" She shook her head silently. "What then?" "I'm so bad," she whispered. She drooped a little nearer to him. "Why do you say such things?" cried the bishop. "You hurt me." "Haven't you met other sinners?" "I would have had your past free from sin." "Oh, my past!" she sobbed and bowed herself in his arms. "My past is past. I'm sinning now." Much may be done by earnest endeavor, and he persuaded himself that his embrace was episcopal. "My child," he murmured at last, soothing her tenderly, "I will not affect to misunderstand what you have said. It would be a false kindness to you, nor will I be guilty of concealing the transgressions of my own heart. Were I a younger man, I might doubt the righteousness of owning that the attachment is mutual, but the years bring wisdom, and at my age we see deeply. My duty is to help you, and I realize that I can help you only by a perfect candor. I acknowledge, therefore, that you are indeed most dear to me." "Oh, you are great!" she exclaimed. "I shall see you still? Promise you'll come here. Don't let me lose you. Say it. Say again you love me."
"You are indeed most dear to me,"
repeated the bishop, who thought this way of putting it sounded more innocent. He got up and paced the room with agitation.
"You ask me if I will still come here. I do not disguise from myself that many might think that I should answer no. Many might hold it my duty to desert you in the conflict that must be waged, to leave you to bear the brunt of it alone. I am not one of them. Flight is at best the refuge of a coward. Doughtier than to flee temptation is to confront and conquer it." He swept the hair from his brow with a noble gesture. "I recognize that my highest duty is to share your struggles, to solace and sustain you. Yes, I will come. We have a mighty battle before us, you and I, and we will fight side by side, my comrade, till we win." In other words, he ventured to go to tea there all the time, and had whiskey and soda when it wasn't tea time. 2. How much of what the stage door club said about them was fact, and how much of it was fiction, is a thing that could be decided only by the bishop or Miss Clarges, neither of whom is to be consulted on the subject. But the Reverend Baker Barling, who frequently dropped into the club for the house dinner or a game of poker, heard the gossip, and Baker Barling confided it to Mrs. Baker Barling, and Mrs. Baker Barling, whose wrath against the bishop had in no way abated, manoeuvred for the joy of condoling with the bishop's wife. Miss Clarges was paralyzed one morning by a note in which Mrs. Lilliaton Meadows, mentioning that her husband was the Bishop of Westborough, requested the actress to receive her upon a matter of the utmost importance the same afternoon. The actress's first impulse was to be out when the lady called, her second to telegraph to the bishop for advice. The fear of driving Mrs. Meadows to extremities and the thought that the telegram might fall into the wrong hands prevented her adopting either course. She could only pray for the ability to persuade the visitor that her suspicions were unfounded, and she felt sick with misgiving as the day wore on. How extraordinary of the woman! Whether she meant to be offensive or pathetic, what a folly of her to come! On the stage, of course, such scenes were usual, and Kitty Clarges knew exactly how she would have to behave there, that she would be first mocking, then attentive, and finally moved to repentance. But the theatre was one thing, and life was another. In real life it was preposterous of a person to seek an interview and plead for the return of a husband's heart. In real life it was impossible to return a heart, even if one wished to do it. And in this case the wish was lacking. Miss Clarges was so infatuated by the bishop that she had even been jealous to remember that another woman had a legal claim to him. At the tingle of the bell she caught her breath. She had never seen the other woman, and mixed with her apprehension was a strong curiosity to know what his wife was like. "Mrs. Meadows," announced the maid. The actress turned to the doorway trembling, and saw that the lady was a dowdy little woman with a dreary face. She looked as if she lived at Tunbridge Wells. "Mrs. Meadows, how good of you to call!" Mrs. Meadows advanced awkwardly. It was evident that she was painfully embarrassed. "Miss Clarges, I hope I haven't put you to any inconvenience," she murmured. It is an immense pleasure to me to meet you. Won't you sit down?" For an instant the bishop's wife hesitated. Then she sat at the extreme edge of a chair and moistened her lips. "My visit must appear very strange to you." "Most kind," said Kitty Clarges. "How is his lordship getting on with his play? It'll soon be finished now, I suppose?" "I dare say I really don't know. I didn't come to talk about the play," Mrs. Meadows faltered. "I came because you might do more for me than anybody else alive. Miss Clarges, my husband is in love with you." The start, the bewilderment in the eyes was admirable. "My dear Mrs. Meadows!" "You need not trouble to deny it," said the lady quietly, "because he has acknowledged it to me. But that isn't all. You are in love with my husband." "Are you here to insult me?" cried Miss Clarges, rising. "I have the honour to be one of his lordship's friends. He has been pleased to discuss his comedy with me. Not unnatural, I think. Especially as I hope to produce the piece. As for what you say, there has never been a word, a syllable. Our conversation might have been phonographed for all London to hear." The indignation of her voice quivered into pain. "I wouldn't have had this happen for the world. I can't understand it." She struggled with a sob and suppressed it proudly. "It's cruel." "I don't wonder that he admires you," said his wife thoughtfully. "You have great talent. But I have seen one of your letters to him. Here it is." Miss Clarges gasped and looked at it. She sat down again very slowly. "All right," she said. "I am fond of your husband. Well, it was finding your letter that made me write to you. I heard weeks ago that he was mad about you, but the letter showed me that you cared for him. Oh, I know that I oughtn't to have written. I considered a long time before I made up my mind. But there was so much at stake, I thought you might help me. If you will listen—" "What for?" exclaimed Miss Clarges. "What's the use of my listening? Even if I promised you not to see him again, I wouldn't promise it, but if I did, would it make him any fonder of you? Do you think if I lost a man I should beg the other woman to give him back to me? I should know she couldn't do it. I should know I might as well beg her to give me back my innocence. And I shouldn't reproach her either. I'd reproach myself. I should call myself a fool for not holding my own. Women like me don't lose the man they want. They know how easy it is for him to leave us, and we take the trouble to keep him. It's you good women who are always being left. After you've got a man, you think you've nothing more to do. Marriage is the end of your little story. So you take it for granted it must be the end of his. The more you love him, the sooner you bore him. You go bankrupt in the honeymoon. You're a back number to him before you've been married a month. He knows all your life and all your mind and all your moods. You haven't a surprise in reserve for him, and then you wonder he yawns. Great heavens! To hold a man's interest, show him your heart as you pull out a tape measure, an inch at a time. I adore your husband. I venerate him. My guilty love has made me a purer woman. You can't realize that. I don't expect you to realize it. But surely you must know that if you wept and went down on your knees to me, I couldn't say, 'Because the right's all on your side, he shall never think about me any more'?" "You misunderstand the object of my visit," said Mrs. Meadows meekly. "I didn't come to weep to you. I didn't come to beg you to say that he should never think about you any more. I came to beg you to tell me what you find in him to love." "Huh?" ejaculated Miss Clarges. "I came to beg you to tell me what you find in him to love," repeated the elder woman in plaintive tones. "You see, to you he is only an episode, but unless I choose to make a scandal, and I have daughters to consider, I must expect to spend many more years with him. If you will help me to discover some attraction in him, it will make life far easier for me." Kitty Clarges sat staring at her dumbly. "You find no attraction in him?" she stammered at last. "It is unconventional of me to admit it to you, but as I say, there is so much at stake, I feel justified in asking your assistance. To me he is tedious beyond words to tell. If you would explain why you adore him, if you would show me some merit, some spark of talent or wit or humor, something to make his pretensions less intolerable, you don't know how thankful to you I should be." "Your husband is a great man." She spoke with a touch of uncertainty. "Oh, no. And I should be foolish to ask so much. A moderately intelligent man is all that a woman like me has the right to expect. The bishop is unfortunately very, very dull. Believe me, I have tried most conscientiously to be deceived by him. I used to read his press notices and say, 'Look what the newspapers say about him, it must be true.' But I knew it wasn't. I used to listen to his sermons. There aren't many of them. They've been the same sermons for 20 years, and say, 'What lovely language, what noble thoughts! How proud his little Mildred should be!' But though I was a young girl then, I knew that the lovely language was all sound and no sense, and that the noble thoughts came out of the dictionary of quotations. Oh, Miss Clarges, you are a brilliant woman, far, far cleverer than I. He must have some stray virtue that my earnest search hasn't brought to light, or you couldn't gush so romantically about him. Help me to see it. Think how he wearies me. Tell me what the virtue is." The actress was breathing heavily. Her nostrils fluttered. On her bloodless cheeks the delicacy of maiden bloom stood out in unbecoming blotches. To hear that she idolized a man whom this little provincial, in last year's fashions, disdained as a bore, robbed her of speech. She had not believed there could be such depths of humiliation in the world. Some seconds passed while the suppliant watched her wistfully. "If you don't care for your husband, I'm afraid I couldn't teach you to love him." "No, no, I only thought you might help me to put up with him. I'm not unreasonable. I'd be grateful for small mercies. If you'd mention a ray of interest in him, I'd keep my eyes on that and make the most of it. You're not vexed with me for coming?" "Oh, not at all. I suppose you've been very amiable. Our interview has been rather quaint. I'm sorry I can't oblige you." "Well," sighed Mrs. Meadows, "it can't be helped. But I must say I'm disappointed. When I found out there was a woman in love with him, it simply amazed me. I felt it only right to consult you. It seemed such an opportunity to improve matters at home. Still, there it is. If you can't tell me, you can't." She was very downcast. "Then I'll say good afternoon. May I offer you some tea?" quavered Kitty, clinging to the mantelpiece. "Thank you so much, but I'm afraid I must be going now. I promised to see our secretary at the office of the Mission Fund at 4 o'clock. Goodbye, Miss Clarges. You needn't tell the bishop that I called. It has been quite useless." She sighed herself out. Now, though Kitty Clarges endeavoured to persuade herself by turns that Mrs. Meadows was a fool, incapable of appreciating her husband, and that Mrs. Meadows was a diplomat, scheming to disenchant her with him, both endeavours were unsuccessful. She could not think the woman an utter idiot, and still less was it possible to think her a genius. Kitty Clarges was less entranced by the Bishop in their next meeting. Between them lurked a dowdy little figure, regarding her with astonished eyes. The astonishment shamed her as no homily could have ever done. The figure was present at all their meetings, and often she lost sight of the Bishop's classical features and could see nothing but his wife's eyes wondering at her. His eloquence was no longer thrilling. She was obsessed by the knowledge that it wasn't good enough for the woman in the modes of Tunbridge Wells. Before long the sight of her own dove-coloured gowns began to get on her nerves, and gradually she discarded them. Once when the Bishop proposed to visit her, she told him that she would be lunching out. A few days later she wrote that unforeseen circumstances denied her the hope of producing his comedy. His urgent letter of inquiry remained unanswered. When he called for an explanation, she was not at home. End of section 20. Section 21 of The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tavarish. The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories by Leonard Merrick. A Reverie. Rebecca is in the bedroom dressing, and Lucy, who looked very sweet in her simple frock, has gone to some entertainment at her school. So I am alone. It's a comfortable chair, and the room is quiet, though overhead I hear my wife as she moves to and fro between the wardrobe and the toilet table. She has heavy feet. I'm glad she is going to the Jacobses. It'll be a treat to me to spend the evening by myself. What a fine fire I've made up, and my cigar tastes better than usual. Rebecca gets fatter every day, and she has such a silly laugh. But a good woman. Few women would have done so much as she did. I ought to remember that, but instead I'm always remembering. Quite clearly I can see the room I lived in 15 years ago with Dora. How cheap it was, wonderful, but with its refinements too. She could make such pretty things. Why did I not marry Dora? My parents would have been horrified if I had married a Christian. I cannot think of any other reason, unless it was because she didn't worry me with entreaties. She never spoke of it. She had been so poor and friendless. She may have fancied that it would be ingratitude to ask for more than I had done. And the business was my father's in his lifetime. I could not afford to quarrel with him. She must have known that. She must have known I could not afford to quarrel with him, even if I had been anxious to marry her. Fervently, though it is all past, and the shrub that was planted on her grave has grown big beyond the railings, I hope she did not grieve. I have wondered many times since. She was so gentle and so pure, that perhaps she often suffered while she smiled and kissed me. And she died and was buried. And the child, the baby Lucy, was given to strangers to be nursed. How long ago it seems! In another life. But I wish that Lucy might have called me Papa. My cigar is out. Rebecca, she was slimmer when her family made up the match between us. Yes, and good-looking. And my sorrow for Dora had faded. 2 or 3 years had passed. I was my own master then, and business was good. I was happy with Rebecca. I gave her lots of diamonds, and the other women envied her. And at home we got on very well. If we had had children of our own, I wonder. Lucy was 4 when Rebecca took her. She asked no questions. To this day she has never asked me anything. It shows a big heart. She is like a mother to Lucy. Shall I ever forget how grateful I was? The tears came to my eyes when she said yes. She should be worshipped for such a generosity. But Lucy reminds me so of Dora. Not at first. No. Just a little thing not able to talk plainly. It is recently that I see the resemblance. She is 14 now, and with every move she brings back Dora before my eyes. She has the same features, the same trick of smiling sometimes with the mouth a little to one side. She grows more and more like Dora. I look at her across the table when she and my wife and I sit at meals together, and my throat gets tight. The past is suddenly alive to me, and I want to spring up and throw my arms round her neck. But Rebecca might guess the truth, and it would pain her to the heart if she suspected. Yet it is true, and I can't help it, that in the child who reminds me of the dead so vividly my wife has a rival here in our home. It is the child that she consented to adopt who reminds me innocently that my wife is fat and silly. It is Lucy who, as I watch her at her lessons, recalls to me the thoughtful face of the girl I used to love. And I regret, God forgive me, I regret with all my soul, and would be young once more with Dora by my side. I would see her by my side today. How hot it is! The window should be open such a night. Rebecca has come downstairs. She wears her black satin and powders her nose again before the mirror. She persuades me to accompany her. I shall be dull alone. My head aches, otherwise... Bye-bye. Enjoy yourself, my dearest. End of section 21.
Section 22 of The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories by Leonard Merrick. The Reconciliation. I've often said that I could not be your wife, but I would never tell you why. Tonight, suddenly, I want to tell you why. I want to write to you. I wonder if you will understand. You've heard how my marriage ended. For many months after I divorced him, I could concentrate my thoughts on nothing but my wrongs. I had no child, no interests. The hurricane of pain and jealousy swept me day and night. Then resentment grew less vehement, faded into lassitude. By very slow degrees I concerned myself with other things. Later, I began to dwell on scenes of my brief happiness with him, and though remembrance made me cry for the irrecoverable, to remember was sweet. Moments which had been trivial while they lasted assumed in retrospect an air of exquisite companionship. It was my weakness to recall some commonplace incident and indulge myself by reanimating its minutest details. The hours that I lived most vividly were the hours that I lived in looking back. Even when I found pleasure in society again, recollection remained a secret joy. I could forget by this time and amuse myself, had my vanities and vexations, was socially like any other woman, entertained in ordinary ways, but clandestinely I still revisited the past. So 13 years went by, and, unsuspected by my dearest friends, I communed mentally with a young husband who, in these reveries, had grown no older. I tried to bear in mind that he was older, much older than I, but I could think of him only as I had seen him last. I repeated, marvelling, that he must be over 40 now, but in my memories I laughed and talked with the personality that I had known. Although I told myself that I might pass him unrecognized, the face that I smiled to in my visions was the face of the young man that he used to be. I believe you have sometimes wondered who your rival was. He was the man that my divorced husband once had been. Last September I was at Pourville. One morning in the hotel, glancing at an English paper, I read that he had just arrived in Paris. I meant to leave for Paris myself towards the end of the week, and I sat thinking how very soon he and I would be passing through the same streets. Doubtless we had drifted close to each other many times before, but I had not known it, and somehow, while the impulse was very strong, I wrote to him. "I do not know," I wrote, "whether it will please or distress you to hear from me. If my letter is unwelcome, burn and forget it. Speaking for myself, all ill feeling died long ago. Time has even taught me to think of our first year together and obliterate the rest. Our marriage was a blunder, but so much am I changed from the girl who was your wife that seems to me today no reason why we should never meet again as friends. I shall be at Maurice's on Saturday. If a reconciliation would not be odious to you, if there was no one to resent it, will you come to see me?" When the letter was posted, I said that I had committed an imbecility, but I am not sure that I believed myself. At any rate, I rejoiced half an hour afterwards. By and by, of course, I was sorry again, and so on. Then, on the morrow, something happened. I found his new volume of poems on a chair in the courtyard. Have you ever read any of his poems? But I suppose poetry is not in your line, you great, strong, practical builder of big bridges. On the fly-leaf he had scribbled, "To Janet Herbertson, from her sincere friend, Gilbert Owen." I had picked up the book, eager to read some of it, but I fell to dreaming over the fly-leaf, wondering who Janet Herbertson was. While I wondered, she returned a receipt. "Have I taken your book?" "Oh, thank you." She was a girl to whom I had already spoken once or twice. I had not known her name, and I don't suppose that she knew mine. I call her a girl because she was unmarried, but she could not have been more than 4 or 5 years younger than myself. A girl with a fine figure and abundant health, but, to my mind at least, no features worth mentioning. Her eyes were shallow, and her hair came near to being sandy. Most of her remarks were prefaced by "of course," and she expressed herself in very incisive tones. I had noticed her one day with an easel among the gorse at Varengeville Plage, and I set her down as an amateur, with means. "You didn't go to the links, then?" I said. "Not this afternoon. I was too much interested in this. Have you read any of it?" "No, I only just saw it. It's a new one of his, isn't it?" "It isn't out yet at all. This is what's called an advance copy. Mr. Owens sent it to me yesterday." I couldn't help seeing by the inscription that you knew him. How very nice to receive such compliments from poets. Of course you admire his work?" "I admire some of it very much." "Some of it?" She regarded me with an offensive smile. "Of course, the best in any art is always unintelligible to the public." I was certain she was an amateur now. The arrogance was unmistakable. "I suppose so. Emerson? Have you read Emerson?" "Whom's it by?" I asked viciously. I saw her shudder. "Emerson was one of the world's teachers. Apropos of the impressions to be derived from nature, he said that a tourist could never take away from any place more than she brought to it. Of course, it's the same with a reader. If she hasn't the receptivity, she can't receive." This person educating me! But I wanted to hear about him. I submitted. "I think I follow you," I murmured. She unbent. "If you like, I'll lend it to you presently." "I should be delighted, if you can spare it." "Yes, I shan't read after dinner. In the evening you always play that idiotic game, though, don't you? Well, you can have it in the morning." "If you're sure I shouldn't be robbing you." "Quite. Besides, I've read most of it already, in manuscript." "Really? It must be very fascinating to know a poet so well as that." "Oh, I know Gilbert Owen very well. If you're staying next week, you'll see him here." She tittered self-consciously. "I've told him that the rest would do him good." "Here?" "Yes, but not till Wednesday. I didn't want him till I had finished my picture. Of course I shan't have much time for my work after he comes." "I shall be gone by then," I said. "What a pity. I suppose there's no chance of his coming before?" "Oh, no. He'll come on the day I fixed. Wednesday." "Yes." "To oblige me, you might let him come a little sooner." I laughed. "I'm afraid I can't do that. You had better stay." "I wish it were possible. You must be immensely proud of your influence." "Oh, I don't know. I find myself quite forgetting he's famous, and thinking of him simply as a dear friend." In a pause I glanced at her left hand. There was no ring on it, but I knew that she foresaw one there. She turned a page of his book, and for a minute or two we didn't speak again. Across the begonias the musicians in their red coats were fiddling drowsily, and inside the croupier called "Numero douze." "What's he like?" "Eh? Oh, it's so difficult to say what anyone is like. Do you mean his appearance, or his disposition?" "I think I meant his disposition." "Amusing?" "Amusing? No, I should scarcely describe him as amusing. Of course he can be very brilliant when he meets a foeman worthy of his steel, but his nature is a wistful one. He has suffered deeply, and it has left its mark." "I think I remember reading something," I said. "Wasn't there a case of some sort?" "He made a very unhappy marriage years ago," she said sharply. "His wife was a vapid girl who didn't understand him. He was very much to be pitied." I nodded. I could have struck her across her conceited face. "It must have been hideous," she added, for a man of his intellect to be married to a fool. The begonias were making my eyes ache. Awful, I muttered. I wondered what in the world he could find to admire in her. "Well, you shall be left in peace. I've a sudden fancy for cinq. It's my lucky number." I didn't play. I sat watching the horses swirl and hating her, hating my idiocy in having written to him. I was jealous. Is it heartless of me to say that to you, dear man? I must be frank. I was jealous of her, and when I had the honesty to own it at last, I was glad that the letter had gone. I asked myself if she had more attractions than I. I asked myself, it was abominable, you'll despise me, if I couldn't teach him to humiliate her. There was no note for me at Meurice's when I arrived on Friday, but I had an instinct that he would come next day. I spent the whole of Saturday morning before the mirror. I wonder my maid didn't give me notice. I had my hair dressed in a new way, and snapped at her till she cried before I was satisfied with it. Afterwards I decided that it didn't suit me, and my hair was done as usual after all. The same with my things. I felt myself a sight in everything. My frock had to be changed 3 times. It was 4 o'clock when the waiter came up and frightened me. My knees were trembling and the doorway was a blur. "Gilbert!" "Nan!" "I'm glad you've come," I got out in a horrid dry whisper. We shook hands. He was speaking, but I had turned deaf. I heard a confused sound and strained to distinguish what he said. His face grew clear to me before his words. I saw blankly that he was like someone with a resemblance to the husband I had remembered. "I'm glad you've come," I repeated. It encouraged me to find that my voice was louder. I didn't feel that he was Gilbert. He was someone queerly familiar, but I didn't feel that he was Gilbert. "It was very good and generous of you." His voice seemed different, too. "You haven't changed so much." "Ah? Really? How are you?" "All right. Won't you sit down?" He twitched his trousers to save their bagging at the knees. It may have been mechanical, but it hurt me that he could do it then. "You've been at Pourville?" "Yes, only for a little while." "I've never stayed there. It's very quiet, isn't it?" "Oh, a mite of a place. Just the hotel and the sea. There are beautiful walks, though." "You used to be fond of walking." "I am still." "You're looking wonderfully well." "You look very well, too." "Do you think so?" he asked. "Fact? Not so much older as you expected?" "No," I said. "My hair's going, eh? Begins a little further back than it used to, doesn't it?" "A little more intellectual brow, perhaps. You should try a specialist." "I've tried a dozen. They're no use. The first time you go, the man tells you that you'll be bald directly if you don't use his lotions. Ah, humph. Well, I'll do all that can be done for you. And you buy bottles at half a guinea each, and find they make no difference. Then, when you go again to say there isn't any improvement, he exclaims, 'My, I didn't hope to do so much in the time. This is splendid. Look at all that new hair coming up.' Of course, you like to believe him, and you go on buying his rubbish for 12 months. A hair specialist lives by his knowledge of human nature, not his knowledge of the hair." I knew that he was talking for effect, and I laughed to gratify him. He glanced round the room. "You're very comfortable here." "Yes, this is where I generally stay." "Are you often in Paris?" "Not very often. I'm in London a good deal." "I never go to London, excepting to see a publisher. The atmosphere is fatal. In London I'm commonplace. Positively, the murk gets on my genius. Give me a blue sky and God's sunshine. All artistic natures are very susceptible to external influences. You know that?" I remember you used to say so." "It's just the same with me now. I haven't altered. I feel just as I felt when I was a boy. I'm young, just as young in myself. That's what keeps my work so fresh. That's what people rave about. Other men's stuff ages. Mine doesn't. Everybody says so. The spirit of it's as useful as when I was 20. Temperament." I sickened at the word. Formerly that had been his apology. Today I saw it was his boast. Presently I inquired about his favourite sister, if she was well. "I don't know. I don't often see her now," he said indifferently. I spoke of a chum he had lost, a man at whose death I had pictured him grief-stricken. "It must have been an awful blow to you?" I asked. "Oh, he had got rather tedious," he answered. "Charlie was a bit of an ass." He proceeded to tell me an anecdote of a woman who had paid him a fulsome compliment. While he aimed eagerly at making an impression, while his sole thought was to show me how brilliant and fascinating he remained, he revealed to me that every tendency I had once condemned had developed to a salient feature of his character, that every blemish I had once regretted had grown to be a glaring fault. I am sure that vanity would have urged him to gain my admiration, even if he had found me faded and a frump. I am sure that he had come with that desire, but his eyes told me he found me charming, and his note, by and by, I think, was unpremeditated. "I wish I had been worthier of you," he said. He said it very beautifully, but late. So much too late to give me any pleasure. "Don't let us talk about the past," I murmured. "My coming here today will make me regret it more still." "I hope not. I didn't mean to give you pain. Perhaps it was foolish of me to write." "Oh, you know I am glad you wrote. Only it won't be the last time I see you." "Don't say that." His gaze dwelt on me sentimentally. "I wish it were the first. If I had just been presented to you, we might have become great friends, Nan. Who knows?" "I trust we are friends." He sighed. "It's noble of you to say so, but the friendship you can give me now is only a gentler name for pardon. I might have looked forward to something sweeter if we had just met. I might have won your esteem, your confidence, perhaps even your love. I wonder if you know what it has meant to me this afternoon, to be here like this, with a wall of formality between me and the woman who used to be my wife. The torture, the shame of it. My heart is full of emotion, but I may only speak to you of trivial subjects. I want to pour out my remorse at your feet, and feel your arms about me in forgiveness, but I may only touch your hand, like a stranger. When we parted, I was a boy who ruined his own happiness. Today I am a man, and I realize what I've lost. You make me miserable. Every day I have thought of you, my life empty. What is anything without you? You mustn't talk to me like this. I can't help it. Nan, I'm so wretched. It's my fault for making you come here. No, no, but let me see you again. Tell me I may come tomorrow. I can't. It's Sunday. Let us lunch at Versailles, or Saint-Germain, or somewhere. Let us go into the country. I know a perfectly lovely spot we can motor to in an hour, and the hotel is really quite decent. Say you will. I'm expecting people tomorrow. Well, Monday, Tuesday. You'll be free on Tuesday?" I shook my head. "Then Wednesday. I was going to the sea on Wednesday, but I'll stay. Promise to spare me Wednesday." How easy it had been. I saw the sandy-haired girl's mortification, saw her fuming week by week while he dangled at my side. My petty plan had triumphed, but it brought no joy. "I'm leaving Paris," I said, and when he went I think he was conscious that, after all, his visit had been a failure. But he was speedily at ease again, I know, for those who have no deep affections avoid much of life's unhappiness. For the selfish is the peace. The suffering was for the woman who had felt, for me, to whom the reconciliation had proved more painful than the estrangement. For me, whom reality had robbed of a dream. Always I had seen him as he had been. Now I could see only the man he had become. Our meeting had killed remembrance. I could spend hours in the past no longer. I tried for months, but the spell was gone. The husband of my youth would come to my mind no more. I met only a middle-aged poseur, from whom I turned and fled. Best of men, how I seem to you I do not know, but I have owned the truth. There is nothing more for me to write, excepting, well, all day long I have wished that you were with me, and I am feeling very much alone. End of section 22.
Section 23 of The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason Paul. The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories by Leonard Merrick. The Call from the Past. Once there was a prosperous solicitor, and he had 2 sons. The elder he took into his office. The younger he sent to the bar. The younger boy's name was Robert, and he was generally called Bob. The elder boy's name was Edward, and no one ever called him Ted. Edward went to the office with satisfaction. He was a shrewd youth who made useful friends, and didn't allow pleasure to stand in the way of profit. Before he had been in the business 2 years, he bullied the head clerk, and it was predicted that he would go further than his father. Bob entered his profession negligently. He was a genial fellow who liked bohemian clubs and wrote farces that were never produced. Before he had been at the bar 2 years, he succumbed to an unconquerable passion and went on the stage. The stage had not then been the smartest vocation in England. Viscounts occasionally married dancing girls, but socially that was as high as the theatre had climbed. It may be difficult for English people of today to credit it, but though old Mr. Blackstone was simply a solicitor, he felt humiliated when his son took to play acting. What will be understood more easily is that he was wrathful in thinking of the money he had wasted to make a barrister of a crank. He told the crank that he washed his hands of him, and, as a matter of fact, talked rather like the irate parents in the comedies in which Bob was going to perform. Nevertheless, his growl was worse than his bite, in which he resembled the comedy parents again. Ascertaining that Bob's salary was to be 15 shillings a week, and that the histrionic career was precarious, he undertook to make an annual contribution of £40, payable quarterly for the term of 3 years. At the end of which time, he said, "I think you ought to be able to support yourself if you have really any aptitude as a buffoon." Barring the buffoon, Bob was of the same opinion. Don't laugh at him. He was young. He slammed the door of his chambers rejoicing, and, because his father wished him to change his name, he dropped the Blackstone and called himself Lawless. The old man remarked that Senseless would be better still, but Bob thought not. Now, if this had been a nice, edifying story with the moral presented gratis to every purchaser, Bob would have had only 2 courses open to him. He would either have succeeded brilliantly and moved his father to tears of pride, or he would have found the discomforts unbearable and returned repentant. In reality, he didn't succeed at all, and he had never been so happy in his life. His sole regret was that the tour was short, for when it finished he was out of an engagement. He remained out of an engagement much longer than he had been in one, and subsisted on the parental allowance. The change from the flesh pots of Regent's Park was severe, and if anything could have cooled his stage fever, it would have been cooled now. But it defied even semi-starvation. By and by he obtained another small part, and his temperature was higher still. Confidently he assured himself that by the time the allowance was withdrawn he would be independent of it. And that was where he erred. At the end of the 3 years he was pacing the Strand. He had had hard luck, and old Mr. Blackstone was hard too. He stuck to his guns. Bob must shift by his own abilities henceforward, or Bob must go back to the bar. Bob was footsore, hungry, and penniless. Bob went back to the bar. Of course, there was still his pen. His hopes as an actor had been shivered, but to his ambitions as a dramatist he clung. His pen was the spar in the shipwreck. The night was black, but afar the footlights beamed. Buffeted as he was, he might regain them by his pen. So he wrote more farces and burlesques, and 1 or 2 melodramas as well. His father did not know that. Robert Blackstone, the budding barrister, preserved appearances, and Robert Lawless, the panting playwright, preserved his manuscripts, for they all came back. All, that is to say, with the exception of a farcical comedy which he had actually sold for £25, but which had never been staged. Some of his work was good, but in England the chief qualifications for artistic success are commercial ability and the money to exploit it. Bob lacked both. By degrees he became wary of trying to reach the limelight shore. His struggles grew fainter. By degrees Robert Lawless took some interest in Robert Blackstone. He thought of the bar more, and of the theatre less. One day when his father told him he had handled the brief uncommonly well, he was elated. He was 29 now. Robert Blackstone had begun to cut Robert Lawless out, was travelling faster, proving the better of the pair, and Lawless, who felt rather sore about it at first, presently forgave him. Bob began to look less like a Bob and more like a Robert. People noticed what a strong resemblance there was between him and his brother. As an earnest young barrister, he no longer frequented Bohemian clubs. It was understood that one mustn't go round to Plowden Buildings any more and waste his time. Nobody said to him now, "Come and have a drink, old chap." Occasionally someone might say, "Will you, take a glass of sherry, Mr. Blackstone?" As the years passed, even that was seldom said. He had shaken off the dust of Plowden Buildings, and had chambers in Garden Court. His humour was becoming heavy. The mothers of marriageable daughters found it convulsing. He was spoken of as a man with a future, and dined at dreary houses. Old Blackstone died, and as Robert was making a handsome income, he was mentioned in the will with abundant generosity, wherefore he was rich. So was Edward the solicitor, who had a wife and 3 children now. Edward was proud of his brother. He wanted him to take silk, and to stand for Beckenhampton later. Robert was thinking of these things himself. His age was 41. And here ends the prologue. So we see that this unedifying story may be said to begin at a point long after all orthodox stories have concluded. It really begins 12 years after the prodigal reformed. Reformation, we know, is always final in stories. When the prodigal has once returned to the order of sanctity, we are quite sure that he will never desire change of air. We understand that he will always be just as good and peaceful as we leave him on the last page. Human nature is made like that, in stories. One May afternoon, as Robert came out of court, a man murmured to another, "He's a dry stick, is Blackstone." And Robert overheard and smiled his dry smile. Yes, he supposed that was his social reputation at the bar. As he joined Edward and listened to his pleased comments on the jury's finding, he even admitted to himself that the reputation might be deserved. Odd! How very different from a dry stick he had been once. Edward was animated, for Edward. He kept nodding his grey head and pinched his nose repeatedly between his forefinger and thumb, a habit that he had in conversation. They stood talking in the street for about 10 minutes. It occurred to Robert with a touch of faint surprise that he had long ceased to shirk his brother's company. Yet there was no doubt that Edward was quite as dull a dog as he had ever been. As they talked there outside the law courts, Robert compassionated himself a little for not being bored by Edward. He had been cheerful as he unrobed, but the remark he had caught lurked in his ears, and when he entered his chambers he found himself repeating it. For the defendant, a pleasant phrase today, was momentarily forgotten. A dry stick sounded in his mind instead. He, Bob, had actually become a dry stick. And he was only 41. He lit a cigarette and mused. Beyond the open window the flowers of the garden were bright in sunshine, and the fountain tinkled dreamily. There was a nursemaid with a child among the flowers. He wondered for a moment whether he would have done well to marry. Marvelous in looking back how suddenly success had come. Marvelous to remember how hard he had had to flog his brain at the beginning to earn a legal guinea. If one managed to turn the second corner at the bar at all, one sped on with a rush. But how unlikely it had looked that he would ever turn that corner! How unlikely it had looked in the days when he belonged to the Amity Club, and fellows used to quote his jokes he flashed over a tankard and a steak at 3 in the morning. If his boyish hopes had been justified, if he had had talent as an actor, perhaps life would have tasted better to him after all. Robert Blackstone, K.C. He would soon be that. Robert Blackstone, K.C., M.P.? He might expect it. Sir Robert Blackstone, Solicitor General. It was on the cards. Why wouldn't his heart swell at the prospect? Why didn't he catch his breath? What the deuce had become of all his emotions? Oh, he was getting sentimental, listening to the fountain. Shut the window, ring the bell, see what briefs had come in. And a letter, sir. All right, said Robert. Put it down. The eagerness with which he used once to seize his briefs, the swift glance to learn the fee, the impatience to gather the contents, other incomes, other manners. He pulled the tape off leisurely today. A dry stick, he reiterated. Oh, one had to pay for success, there was no doubt. His gaze wandered to the letter, and rested on it, startled. A little quiver ran through him. For several seconds a sensation that was half pleasure, half pain, held him quite still. The letter had been redirected from Plowden Buildings. It was addressed to Robert Lawless, Esquire, himself. Dear Sir, I have come across the script of your farcical comedy entitled No Flies on Flossick, all rights of which I acquired some years ago. It is a bit antique in parts now, and I think you might like to bring it up to date. I am putting it on at O.H. Ashton-under-Lyne to see how it shapes. We rehearse at P.O.W. Manchester. The first call is for 12 o'clock, Monday 18th. Yours faithfully, Cavendish Pink. When the color had crept back to his face, Robert laughed. The perfunctory laugh that he gave to a judge's joke. He shrugged his shoulders. He put the letter down and laughed again. He was acting to himself unconsciously. After a minute or two, he picked it up and reread it. How had Cavendish Pink come by the play? Acquired it? Not from the author. But the adventures of the manuscript were unimportant. Pink? Pink had been a rather popular comedian. On the seesaw of life Mr. Pink had gone down while Mr. Blackstone went up. For the third time he read the letter. He knew that TR stood for Theatre Royal, but the other abbreviations had mystified him. It occurred to him with emotion that OH meant Opera House and that POW meant Prince of Wales. That he could have forgotten these things even for a moment. He drummed his fingers on the briefs and saw his youth. Of course, he could have nothing to do with the matter. No flies on Flossie, the work we understand, of Mr. Robert Blackstone, the well-known barrister, etc. He shuddered in imagining such a paragraph. He said that it was lucky Robert Lawless was forgotten. Certainly Robert Lawless would reveal nothing to anyone who saw the piece at Ashton-under-Lyne, and doubtless its run would begin and end there. If he were silent, nobody would suspect his connection with it, but, well, if this had happened a few years earlier, he would have gone down to the place just for a day to see the performance. He said he would have felt curious about it a few years ago. 3 or 4 hours had passed before he confessed to himself that he was curious now. He was in his library after dinner, and though he had no intention of humoring his curiosity, he humored his mind. It dwelt on scenes in the farce that had appeared to him brilliant when he wrote them. Would they appear brilliant today? He remembered the evening when he scribbled "curtain," and Dick turned up and heard the last act read. "Jove! I didn't think you had it in you," Dick had said. He was sitting on the window sill. How it all came back, how time flew. The score of hopes and disappointments the work had brought. With what passion he had despaired at that age. Could he despair so passionately at this? And then the excitement when the thing was taken. What a whirlwind of exultance! That night that he got the news, he had dragged Dick out for oysters just before Scott's closed, and afterwards they had sat up talking till daylight. The piece was to be produced a few weeks hence, and Dick was stipulated for 2 stalls on the first night to take his girl. 13 years ago! And Dick was dead. On the morrow Robert decided that he might after all run down to Ashton-under-Lyne. He said he would not enter the stage door. No one would surmise that the author was present. He would simply take a seat in the dress circle like anybody else. Why not? To associate himself with No Flies on Flossie was impossible, but to resist the desire to peep at it would be motiveless. No doubt when he was in the theatre he'd be hotly ashamed of having perpetrated such trash. Still, he made no reply to Cavendish Pink. He was not prepared to revert to comic dialogue, even under a pseudonym, nor did he see his way to correspond on the subject. Probably it would be inferred that the letter had gone astray or that Mr. Lawless had died. Well, he was dead. Yet Robert Blackstone owned to himself that he regretted being unable to attend Bob Lawless's rehearsals. He did not own it all at once. He regretted it for some time before he owned it. Then he said again that if this had happened a few years earlier he might have... Just for a day or two? Yes, he would have given himself the fun then. It wouldn't have mattered so much a few years earlier. How ardently, in the period when he was a small part actor, he had looked forward to striding about a stage as the author and telling the company what to do. He had never rehearsed in the West End theatre, or he would have known that authors are rather small fry after the plays are written. It had been his dream. The author! And of course he would be privileged to smoke. He had imagined himself with a cigar between his lips, and his hands in the pockets of a fur overcoat. In his dream it was generally winter, because he wanted to wear a fur overcoat. Nice girls waylaid him in the wings and said, "Do write in a line for me to speak, Mr. Lawless, please." And he did, the courtly consideration that he had always shown, in his dream, to the humblest member of the cast, the glowing terms in which everyone had spoken of him, in his dream. It would have been agreeable to go to Manchester for the rehearsals. About a week later he said that of course he wouldn't be so stupid, but that as a matter of fact he could go if he chose. He could go as Mr. Lawless. It was in the highest degree unlikely that anyone in a third-rate provincial company would know his face. He wouldn't do it, because he had long ago left such follies behind, but there was really nothing else to prevent him. The first call is for 12 o'clock, Monday, 18th instant. Constantly the man thought of it. Sometimes he fingered the letter again. Daily, in the drawer of his desk, under the documents, under the briefs, it tempted him, the call from the past. Oh, out of the question. He supposed it would be a folly. After all, should he go? If the Easter term did not end on the 16th of May, there would have been no story, but it does. He felt strange to himself when he took his ticket on Sunday. He felt excited, nervous, guilty. On the platform he avoided a man whom he knew. He realized the sensations of a fugitive from justice and threw an apprehensive glance about the restaurant car. What should he say if he were asked where he was going? He was sorry the rehearsals were to be held in a big city like Manchester. What more likely than that an acquaintance would run against him in the street? As to the hotel, it would brim with danger. At any moment someone might exclaim, "How do you do? What has brought you here?" But to be sure, he merely meant to remain in a hotel for the night. On the morrow he would go into lodgings. They would be extremely uncomfortable, but at all events they would be private, and it was only for a week, after all. A week would soon pass. He found himself wishing that it had passed already. Rain was falling when he arrived at Manchester. He spent a melancholy evening in the smoke-room. Presently he saw a theatrical paper, and turning it over, observed advertisements of professional apartments. Several of the advertised houses were in Manchester. The idea of installing himself in theatrical lodgings again carried a little tremor with it, but it was not unpleasant. These addresses to his hand, moreover, would spare him trouble. Rain was falling when he shaved. No matter. It would be well to make his arrangements before he went to the rehearsal. He breakfasted briskly, opposite a commercial traveller who performed extraordinary feats with a knife and fork. At 10 o'clock he had his bag put onto a cab. All Saints, he said, for in Manchester all theatrical landladies and All Saints are neighbours. The side streets of All Saints were not prepossessing. As he rang the first bell, he glanced about him wonderingly. Had he really been happy in places like this when he was young? He was relieved when the slatternly householder answered that she had only a combined room. He interviewed several householders without success. Gradually the manner in which he made his applications lost something of its legal stiffness. He laboured for a touch of the old-time freedom which he knew was demanded by the situation. He rang another bell, and a young woman in curling pins came to the door. "What rooms have you got this week?" asked Robert, uneasily familiar. "What do you want?" said the woman. "I want a sitting room and bedroom," he said, and she was able to accommodate him. Against the piano was a pile of comic songs. On the mantelpiece were likenesses of performers in tights. The rooms were cosily furnished, and the rent was 10 shillings a week, inclusive of gas and fires. The Manchester weather was still chilly. "I'll take them," said Robert. When he had unpacked his bag, he smoked a cigar in the parlour and smiled. "One always returns to one's first love," he mused, Really, the first love looked attractive, though he viewed the signboard of a mechanical chimney sweep through the window. Presently he asked his landlady for her card. "I'll give you my professional card," she said, "but it has got the address on it. I'm in the profession myself." He read, "My Lady Superba, Terpsichorean Gymnast." "That's me," she said, pointing. "That portrait there. I only let rooms as a 'obby. I don't let regular all the year round. Think it's good?" "It doesn't flatter you," said Robert, but she was captivating in her gymnast costume. He would never have supposed the photograph was meant for her. "I'm fortunate to find you. Letting this week." "Well, it's like this. It gives me something to do when I'm at home. That's what my husband says. He says, 'It gives you something to do.' And I don't take ladies, they're a bit too much. Can we have some hot water, Ma? All hours of the day. Can I come and eat my curling tongs in the kitchen fire, Ma? Ladies are a handful, and, as I say, I only let as a hobby. I'm going on tour again in August. Perhaps you've seen me in the halls?" "I've often applauded you in the halls," he said, courteously and truthful. "I was puzzled why your face was so familiar to me." He was conscious that he hadn't recovered the note yet. He knew that he was being much too formal. Could he pluck up the spirit to call a landlady "Ma" again himself? There was an unaccustomed exhilaration in his veins as he drove to the Prince of Wales's. He did not define the feeling, but what he felt was younger. When the cab jerked to a stoppage, his pulses beat like a lover's. He leapt out and saw "Stage Entrance" painted on a dirty door. Again he pulled a stage door open. "What name?" he was asked. "Mr. Lawless," he answered, and all at once he did not know if he was happy or ashamed, but he knew that he trembled. The theatre looked dark for the first minute. He received a dim impression of ill-dressed people, drew a breathful of mouldy atmosphere that swept him back into the past. A vociferous man shook hands with him and called him "my boy." "So you've turned up, my boy. That's all right. Afraid you hadn't had my note." "How do you do, Mr. Pink?" responded Robert. They sat down in the stall swathed in holland wrappers, and the mist before them melted. The ill-dressed people acquired features. He realized that the rehearsal had begun, and that the figures on the stage were the butler and the maidservant reading the opening scene of his farce. "It wants refreshing up, Lawless," said Mr. Pink. "It's a bit Noah's Arky here and there, old-fashioned. Still, I think there's stuff in it. I'd like you to keep your ears open, see where you can stick in some lines, make it modern, my boy, make it a bit topical, you know what I mean." "Oh, of course," said Robert with dismay. "Yes, certainly, I must see what I can do." He was painfully embarrassed. He had not felt so nervous since the day he heard himself pleading in court for the first time. When the vociferous man left him, he thanked heaven. Vaguely he thought of making his escape, of sending a telegram to say he was recalled to town. Mr. Lawless? A pale, shabby girl had come to him. She had very beautiful grey eyes. He was surprised that he had overlooked her. "Yes?" he said. "I'm to play Flossie. I wanted to ask you a question about her. Is she simple in the first act, or only putting it on?" He had no longer any views on the subject, but it would never do to say so. "Simple," he said. "Oh, decidedly simple in the first act." "That's what I thought," she nodded. "And Mr. Pinks wants me to do it the other way. Mr. Pink says she's only putting it on." He perceived that he had encouraged her to defy the management. "Of course," he added hastily, "when I say simple, I mean relatively simple. Everything is relative." "Oh, yes," she said. But she was evidently at sea. After a moment she went on. "What I really want to know is how she is to speak those lines sitting on the hamper. Is she sincere in that speech, or isn't she?" "That, of course, is the question," murmured Robert. "Yes, precisely, that Speech is it's the keynote to the part, she said. He wished distressfully he could remember what speech she meant. Perhaps, after all, he had better be frank. To be quite honest with you, he said, I wrote the piece a good many years ago, and since then Oh, I see, she laughed. How funny. Since then you've written so many others that you've forgotten what it's about. Exactly, said Robert. That is to say, not at all. I haven't written any others, but I have forgotten what it's about. They regarded each other silently for a moment. She seemed a singularly nice girl. I was quite a young man when I wrote it, he said abruptly. And you've done nothing since? Well, not in the dramatic line. You're rehearsing my last attempt. Oh, I do hope it'll be a success, she said earnestly. Then you'll go on working. It must be rather queer to see us rehearsing a piece you wrote so long ago. It is, said Robert. Very queer. He paused again. He was again abrupt. Once I knew every line of the 3 acts by heart. She lifted her eyes to him gravely and didn't speak for a second. He liked her for not speaking. He saw that she understood. How it must take you back, she whispered. He sighed and smiled. So you see, Mr. Pink probably knows more about your part today than the author does. You needn't tell all the company what I've said. As if I should, she exclaimed. Oh, there's my cue. I must fly. Miss Wilson, shouted Pink. Come on, Miss Wilson. Please, take up your cues. My fault, called Robert. I'm to blame. He looked back over her shoulder, smiling at him as she ran, and somehow the rehearsal was more interesting to Robert. The nice girl read the lines he had invented years before, and listening to her, he remembered. Rain was falling when the rehearsal finished. She hadn't an umbrella. Which way do you go? He asked as the stage door slammed. All Saints, she replied. Rumford Street. That's my way too. I want a cab. I can give you a lift. A cab? She was openly astonished. If you must squander money, you can take a penny car. But why not walk? Is that what you do in the wet? Well, if I took a cab every time it was wet in Manchester, my salary wouldn't go far, would it? I have no idea what your salary is. £3, she said frankly. It isn't much for a leading lady, eh? It isn't much for a leading lady, but it's a good deal for a young girl. In any other business, £3 a week wants a lot of earning. Oh, I know, she said. I've got young brothers in the city. They call me the millionaire of the family. Do they like your being on tour alone? Well, you see, it was necessary for me to earn my own living. Things weren't very bright at home when I grew up. I don't spend all my salary on the delicacies of the season. I send half to my mother every week. I couldn't be any help to her if I were in a clerkship like the boys. But you're fond of the stage, aren't you? You sounded enthusiastic when you floored me with those questions. She shrugged her shoulders. At the beginning, I was in love with it. I've been in the profession 8 years now. You're giving me all your umbrella. There's no expense attached to that, said Robert. The cars were full, and she was evidently averse from a cab, so they went along Oxford Street afoot, keeping close together. I suppose you'll go and see a show tonight? She inquired. I hadn't thought of it, he said. Shall you? There's nothing else to do when one isn't playing. It's ghastly sitting in diggings all the evening, isn't it? It must be dull if you're alone, he asserted. It occurred to him that his own evening was going to be very dull indeed. Oh, I'm not alone. I'm with the girl who plays Aunt Rachel. But it's dull anyhow. We thought of asking for seats at the St. James. I I think, said Robert, that I'll go too. Perhaps I shall see you there? Or we might all go together, mightn't we? Why, yes, she replied. It would be very nice. Let's. It would be delightful, said Robert. Yes, let's. They had reached her door, and she asked him if he would go in and have some tea. He said he would. They found the other girl at home, toasting crumpets. Miss Wilson toasted crumpets. Robert toasted crumpets also. They all knelt on the hearthrug and toasted crumpets together. His hostess cried that they were rising in their profession, having the author to tea. He laughed. He cracked a joke. He wondered what Edward would say if he could see him. At the St. James the girls obtained 2 stalls for nothing, and Robert insisted on paying for one, though Miss Wilson reproved him for such waste of money. "We could quite easily have asked for 3," she said. "It is silly of you. You make me angry." Greatly daring, he proposed supper when the performance was over. The restaurants of Manchester were far to seek, but he didn't know that. He even told himself that it mattered nothing if he were recognized. The girls were ladies. A man had a right to take his friends to supper. However, they wouldn't go. That is to say, Miss Wilson wouldn't go. The other girl looked as if she wanted to. Miss Wilson said he must wait to see if his piece was a success. If it is a hit, well, perhaps. He understood that she took it for granted he was poor. She wouldn't let him be extravagant. The situation was not without a charm. They chattered gaily as far as her apartments. "I can't ask you in after the show," she murmured. "No, I know," he said. "I remember." As he strolled on, he reflected that the day had been remarkably agreeable. He made for his lodging in high good humour. In Oxford Street he started. He received a shock. Almost he staggered. He had perceived that he was whistling. The terpsichorean gymnast gave him eggs boiled to perfection in the morning, and much better coffee than he got at home. As he tapped the second shell, it occurred to Robert that he had not opened a newspaper yesterday. Extraordinary! How often he had winced in recollecting that he never looked at a newspaper when he was a provincial actor. And actually he had been as bad again. He bought the Manchester Guardian and other papers after breakfast, and kept glancing at the clock. It was rather jolly to sally forth to rehearsal, though when it was time to go, rain was falling. He entered the theatre with zest today. Even he resented less stiffly the vociferous man's calling him "my boy." Miss Wilson's pale face smiled at him as at a friend. He conversed with 1 or 2 other members of the company, and saw his way to inserting a topical allusion in the dialogue. Pink pronounced it "devilish good." Robert the reviving was gratified that Pink thought his line devilish good. When he was asked vociferously if he would "come across and have a drink," he didn't say no. They drank prosperity to the piece in a vulgar bar, and he took back a box of sandwiches, and Peggy Wilson and Aunt Rachel and he shared them in the stalls. Almost the next thing that Robert realized vividly was that it was Friday. Rain was falling. It amazed him how the interval had flown. Aunt Rachel had gone over to Bury, where her fiancé was playing at the Royal, and Miss Wilson, left alone, was coming to tea. Robert had ordered cream with the tea, and simnel cake. He stood at the window, eager-eyed. The signboard of the mechanical chimney sweep did not obtrude itself to him. He remembered how long it was since he last watched for a girl to come to tea. But when she turned the corner, he remembered only that he was to have a gracious afternoon. He wheeled the armchair to the hearth for her, and brought her a footstool. She was less talkative than usual. Somehow, the first few minutes were disappointing. "I have to go on Tuesday," he marked presently, "and then it'll be all over." "But you're coming to Ashton-under-Lyne for the production." "I don't know. I don't know that I shall be able to. I wish I hadn't to go back. I haven't enjoyed anything so much for years. By the way, I want you to do me a favor. I want you girls to come to supper with me on Monday night. I thought we might go and see a show." He didn't notice that he was saying show again instead of theatre, "and have a little supper here afterwards. I'd suggest a restaurant, but there'd be no time to eat anything before we were turned out." "What would your landlady say?" I've sounded her. I said, I suppose you wouldn't think there was any harm in me bringing two ladies in to supper after the show one evening. Certainly not, Mr. Lawless, she said. Would you like it hot? That's a landlady that is a landlady. Will you? We'll see about it, said Miss Wilson. You might say yes, he begged. Give me a happy memory for the end. But it won't be the end. We shall often see you, shan't we, if the piece runs? Perhaps it won't run, and even if it does, I'm a busy man. Too busy to think of your pals. What do you do? Are we pals? He questioned. I'm yours, but are you mine? Really? You've known me such a very little while. No longer than you've known me. It's not the same thing, though. You meet lots of men. I don't meet lots of girls. To me, this week has been quite out of the common. To you, it's only one of the 52. What do you do in London? She inquired again. What are you? A dry stick, said Robert. Well, you aren't a dry stick in Manchester, she said. It was not a brilliant reply, but she couldn't have made one that would have pleased him more. Yet the tea was a failure. She never ate cake, she told him. Somehow she didn't care for tea either this afternoon. She sipped about a quarter of a cupful. He had scarcely stirred his own when she was declaring she must go. You won't think it rude of me if I run away now? He gave her her muff blankly. A creature of moods, as changed as an April day. But when she was sunny, how sunny! The table looked pathetic to him when she had gone. He stood at the window, downcast. The signboard of the chimney sweep darkened the road. Mademoiselle Superba put the simnel cape on the top of the piano because there wasn't a sideboard, and it stood there uncovered till it was dusty. Then the night of the supper arrived, and there was a galantine, and prawns in aspic, and a mayonnaise, and the first thing the creature of moods did when she came in was to pounce on the dusty cake and devour a slice before she took her hat off. "Peggy!" exclaimed the other girl reprovingly. "I may?" she cried, flashing a glance at Robert. Yes, she knew she might. She knew she might do anything she chose here. "I'm going to have another light," she said, and lit another burner of the gaselier. Mademoiselle Superba, majestic in black silk, with pendant pearls in her ears, and her hair dressed like Truefitt's widow, looked in for a moment to ask if all was well. Robert thanked her for doing it so extremely well. Peggy said sweetly, "I hear you're in the profession too." The woman was pleased at that. So was Robert. It was nice of Peggy. Because there was no sideboard, cutlery and plates were set forth on the piano. Because there was no champagne glasses, they drank the champagne out of tumblers. "Didn't I forbid you to be extravagant?" cried Peggy. He liked forbid. "Forgive me," he smiled. "This once," she laughed. "But you must be very economical in London." "I shall have no parties like it in London, I assure you." "Nor I," said she. "Do you live in London?" She threw him a nod. "Couch End." "Tell me more," he urged. "And let me give you both some salad." "More?" "Well, once we had a servant, now we haven't. I do housework when I'm at home. I blacklead the grates. That's why my hands aren't pretty. Don't," he said, pained. Her hands weren't pretty, but he revered them now he knew the reason. "Peggy!" said the other girl, dismayed. The other girl was obsessed by manners when she was out. "I'm frightfully untidy in the morning. In novels the poor heroine always has on snowy cuffs and collars with her rags. Pickles! In real life the poor heroine has to think of the laundry bills. Oh, you'd be shocked at me in the morning. After the boys have gone, I turn a room out sometimes, my skirt pinned up and a duster over my head. Can you see me? Mother's not very strong. The cooking's business enough for mother. Then I go up to the agents and try to get something to do. In a very smart costume, with a picture hat, I made it, and white gloves. Oh, you'd be impressed by Peggy in the afternoon. You wouldn't recognize me in the Strand. You're not seeing my best clothes here, don't think it. I'm in an engagement. I'm stopping the expenses." "Peggy!" groaned the other girl again. He divined a kick under the table. "You're coming down to see the dress rehearsal on the 5th, Mr. Lawless," she struck in. "It would be a treat to me, but I can't. I've somewhere else to go." "It would be a treat to him," pealed Peggy. "We shall be kept in the theatre half the night, we shall be dog-tired, and he would find it a treat. What it is to be young! Where have you to go, Mr. Dramatist?" "I have to go to a very dull public dinner on the 5th," he said. "I shall think of you dog-tired in the garden act when they serve the champagne rôti." "Send us the champagne rôti," she said. "It'd be much more use." She snatched a prig of parsley from a dish and stuck it in her hair. "Mother always tried to kill my passion for dress," she cried. He proffered her mayonnaise, and she said she wanted to play the piano, though he feared that even a landlady who was a terpsichorean gymnast might have objections to her rattling Florodora at 1 in the morning. His spirits were high until she forsook the music stool and sank to reminiscence on the hearthrug. Then she made his heart ache. She told him some of her vicissitudes. No engagement, no money, no food. His eyes filled as he listened. What this girl had been through! It was 2 o'clock. He saw his guests home. Rain was falling. "Good night, good bye." He looked at Rumford Street for the last time. How familiar it had become. "Don't forget me," he heard himself whisper, clasping Peggy's hand. Her gaze assured him. She went in. The step was desolate. He turned thoughtfully away. And as he walked back to the room where she had been, he knew he was in love with her, with the theatre, with the life he used to lead. In the wet, black streets of Manchester, he saw the naked truth, and he realized that his life was a failure. A man could change his environment, but not himself. He felt that he would be happier earning £3 a week, like her, on the stage than he would ever be as Robert Blackstone, K.C. One mustn't say these things, but he felt it, felt that he would rejoice to be a minor actor again, and see Peggy in the morning, and see Peggy every day. No Flies on Flossie tottered for 6 nights, died, and was buried. You may read those facts elsewhere. These are the facts concerning No Flies on Flossie which you may read only here. And in Garden Court, Temple, there was for a long time a distinguished barrister debating a subtle point. He questioned if, when he made a trip to the past and grew enamored of it, he fell in love with a girl or only with an atmosphere, because that he was in love, still in love, was indisputable. He looked back constantly and yearned. The sole doubt was, with what was he in love? It was the weak spot in the case, and with his usual keenness he put his finger on it. He discerned how liable he was to be deceived, how naturally he might be attributing to the girl the fascination that belonged to the surroundings. If it was the atmosphere that lent Peggy enchantment, he would be insane to choose a wife so different from, say, the placid matron who blessed Edward. Per contra, if he loved Peggy herself, why should he tramp the room like this, instead of asking her to marry him? He swore he did love the girl herself. He trembled lest her halo was the limelight. Then, having come to a conclusion, he found her advertisement in the Stage, and wrote asking her to call on him at Mr. Blackstone's chambers. She went promptly. The dignified clerk ushered her into Robert's presence, and Robert had never seen that room look so gay. "How good of you to come!" he exclaimed happily. "How good of you to think of me, you mean," she said. "I've been out ever since No Flies finished. Have you written another piece? And are you going to offer me a part in it? I say, you do know swells. Who? Blackstone?" She nodded. "Do you think he'll come in while I'm here? I was reading about him the other day. Miss Peggy Wilson would be going strong meeting celebrities at the bar. This is the Blackstone, isn't it? The K.C.?" "He's a very recent K.C.," murmured Robert. "There's his new wig in that box." "Ooh, do let me look," she said, darting radiantly. "May I?" You may even try it on, if you like, said Robert. He wouldn't mind. She had her hat pins out in a second. Oh, isn't Peggy going strong? She laughed. How does it suit me? And then turning from the strip of glass, why are you so grave all of a sudden? Didn't you mean me to? Yes, yes, I was thinking what a fool I had been not to beg you to come sooner, sighed Robert. Take it off, and let me talk to you. Serious? Very serious. An engagement. You are a tramp. I wanted one so badly. Ah, but you mustn't accept this one unless you like it, and I hope you don't mind its being a short engagement. Peggy, I love you. I love the ground you walk on and the clothes you wear and everything you say and do. Will you be my wife? Oh, she gasped. Her face was colorless. Can't you care for me? I do care, she whispered, and it seemed incredible, yet they were round her, and his heart was thumping like a boy's. Oh, my sweet, he stammered, releasing her at last, just like a boy. Oh, my sweet. And her color came back, and she smiled up at him with a smile that no other woman had ever equaled. Let me put on my hat before Blackstone comes in, she said joyously. Look what you've done to my hair. It'd give us away. Peggy, said Robert, I'm Blackstone. The smile faded. She stood gazing at him, wide-eyed. I called myself lawless when I wrote that farce. Then I chucked writing and went in for the bar. I'd forgotten all about the thing for years when I got Pink's note, but I couldn't resist going down to the call. I went as a lark. Nobody knew me. I thought it wouldn't make any difference. And then I met you, Peggy, and it made all the difference in the world. Why don't you laugh? You're a great man, the girl said solemnly. You oughtn't to marry me. Oh, my dear, he cried. Don't you understand that I, the real I, am the man you saw there, and that only you do see the real me? London has forgotten the author of that piece, but he didn't die, darling. His heart's just the same, though he looks so different. Robert Blackstone's the man who wears the wig and gown and can make things right for your mother and the youngsters, and who'll give you a title by and by, my love. But your husband'll be the bohemian who toasted the crumpets and lodged at Mademoiselle Superba's, the Terpsichorean gymnast. You shan't have time to wish for anything. I'd like to buy the earth for you, and you must come to hear me speak, and I want you to be proud of our position. But at home I shall always be the boy who fell in love with you, Peggy, the Bob Lawless who went to look for his youth and found it. Beyond the open window, the flowers of the garden were bright in sunshine, and the fountain tinkled dreamily. There was a nursemaid with a child among the flowers. He knew with thanksgiving that he was doing well to marry. Will you kiss me again, sweetheart? Yes, she said. Bob. The end. End of section 23. Recording by Jason Paul. End of The Man Who Understood Women and Other Stories by Leonard Merrick.